June 4th, 1942. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers burning and sinking at Midway. Admiral Yamamoto, the man who planned Pearl Harbor, knew in that moment that Japan had lost the war. August 15th, 1945. Japan surrenders after 2 atomic bombs. 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days between knowing they'd lost and actually surrendering. In that time, over 2 million Japanese military personnel died. 500,000 Japanese civilians died. Millions more across Asia died. All while Japan's leadership knew victory was impossible. This isn't a story about when Japan lost World War II. It's about when they knew they'd lost and why they kept fighting anyway. And the answer reveals one of the most tragic aspects of the entire war. Let me show you the moment delusion met reality and why reality couldn't stop the war machine. In 1940, when Japanese military leaders were planning the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto warned them explicitly. He said, "I can run wild for 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." He understood American industrial capacity. He knew what Japan was up against, and he told them that if the war lasted beyond 6 months, Japan would lose. They attacked anyway. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. And for exactly 6 months, Yamamoto's prediction held true. Japan ran wild. They conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma. They pushed across the Pacific. It looked unstoppable. The Japanese military seemed invincible. Then came June 4th, 1942, the Battle of Midway, and Yamamoto's 6-month window slammed shut. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sunk in one day: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Over 3,000 trained aircrew dead. These weren't just ships, they were irreplaceable strategic assets crewed by pilots who'd trained for 4 years or more. Japan's entire carrier doctrine, their offensive capability in the Pacific, destroyed in a single afternoon. The Japanese naval staff knew immediately what this meant. They'd lost the strategic initiative. From this point forward, Japan would be fighting defensively, reacting to enemy moves instead of dictating the pace of the war. And when you're fighting a defensive war against an enemy with 10 times your industrial capacity, you've already lost. It's just a matter of time. But here's what makes this fascinating and tragic. The naval staff knew. Yamamoto knew. Senior commanders knew, and they couldn't say it out loud. The Japanese government concealed the defeat at Midway from the public. Newspapers reported a great victory. Radio broadcasts celebrated sunken American carriers. The truth was classified. Families of dead sailors were told their loved ones died in training accidents. The Japanese people had no idea their war had just become unwinnable. Why the secrecy? Because admitting defeat was culturally and politically impossible. Japanese military culture was built on the concept of Bushido, the warrior code that emphasized honor, loyalty, and fighting to the death. Surrender was the ultimate shame. Admitting you couldn't win was almost as bad. So they kept fighting, and they kept the truth from everyone, including themselves. But knowledge has a way of spreading, especially when the evidence becomes overwhelming. By late 1942 and early 1943, Japanese economists and industrial planners were running the numbers, and those numbers told a story of inevitable defeat. Let me show you what they saw. In 1943, the United States built 85,000 aircraft. Japan built 16,000. In 1944, the U.S. built 96,000 aircraft. Japan built 28,000. Over the entire war, the United States produced 300,000 aircraft, compared to Japan's 76,000, 4 times as many planes, and the gap was widening every year. Tanks? The United States produced 88,000 tanks during the war. Japan produced 2,500. Steel production? America was making 80 million tons per year. Japan managed 8 million. The United States launched 141 aircraft carriers of all types during the war. Japan launched 16.
These weren't minor differences. This was an industrial mismatch so severe that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome it. Japanese planners knew they were fighting a production war they'd already lost. And then there was the oil crisis. Japan had gone to war largely to secure oil resources in the Dutch East Indies, after America cut off oil exports. In 1941, Japan was importing 80% of its oil. They needed those resources desperately. But by 1944, American submarines had effectively cut off Japan's tanker routes. The numbers were catastrophic. Japan needed 3 million tons of shipping capacity to maintain its economy and military. By 1943, they were down to 2.4 million tons and losing over 200,000 tons per month to American submarines. The merchant marine was being systematically destroyed. By 1945, Japan's military had almost no fuel. Planes couldn't fly, ships couldn't sail. The oil they'd gone to war for couldn't reach Japan even when they controlled the fields. Economic planners saw all of this. They knew the resource war was lost. But like the naval staff after Midway, they couldn't stop the machine. The military controlled the government. Peace advocates didn't just lose arguments, they risked assassination. The political mechanism to admit defeat and negotiate surrender simply didn't exist. Meanwhile, the war ground on, and the evidence of defeat kept mounting. Guadalcanal, August 1942 to February 1943. 6 months of brutal fighting for single island. Japan lost 31,000 troops and hundreds of aircraft trying to hold it. They failed. The lesson was clear. America could not only attack Japanese positions, but take and hold them. The United States was winning the war of attrition, and attrition was the one kind of war Japan absolutely couldn't win. The Japanese Navy exhausted itself trying to supply Guadalcanal, fighting a series of increasingly desperate naval battles. Ships they couldn't replace, sailors they couldn't train fast enough, all thrown into a grinding battle they ultimately lost. And when Guadalcanal fell, it proved that every forward Japanese position could be taken. It was just a matter of time and Americans' willingness to pay the price. But if Midway was when the strategists knew, and 1943 was when the economists knew, there was still one group that held out hope: the political leadership, the government. They needed something more dramatic, more undeniable to accept reality. They got it in July 1944, Saipan.
The American invasion of Saipan was an earthquake that shattered Japanese delusions. Geographically, Saipan sits about 1,500 miles from Tokyo, within range of the B-29 Superfortress bomber. Take Saipan, and suddenly the Japanese home islands were vulnerable to strategic bombing. Everything Japan had fought for, the entire defensive perimeter they'd built, became irrelevant. The battle itself was a nightmare. Japanese forces fought with intensity, and they lost. When the island fell, 22,000 Japanese civilians committed mass. The images and reports from Saipan shocked Japan's leadership. The government that had led Japan into war and insisted they were winning collapsed. Everyone at the highest levels of Japanese government now knew what the Navy had known since Midway and the economists had known since 1943. They couldn't win. They probably couldn't even fight the Americans to a stalemate. Total defeat was inevitable. So they surrendered, right? They admitted defeat, saved lives, ended the war. No. They kept fighting for 13 more months. And this is where the story becomes truly tragic. Because knowing you've lost and being able to stop fighting are two different things. Japanese culture had been militarized to the point where surrender was literally unthinkable. The Bushido Code had been weaponized by military leadership to prevent any discussion of peace. The emperor was considered divine. Only he could order surrender, and he was surrounded by military advisors who would rather see Japan destroyed and dishonored. There was also a genuine belief, as insane as it sounds, that one decisive battle could change everything. Not win the war, that was impossible, but inflict such horrific casualties on American forces that the United States would agree to a negotiated peace instead of unconditional surrender. Let Japan keep the emperor, keep some dignity, avoid occupation.
This was the logic behind kamikaze attacks. Not a brilliant strategy, an admission that Japan had nothing left. Attacks were desperation packaged as heroism and sold to the Japanese people as a path to victory. Young men flew planes loaded with explosives into American ships because their leadership had convinced them this was the only honorable option left. October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, the largest naval battle in history. Japan threw everything they had left into stopping the American invasion of the Philippines. They lost. The Japanese Navy was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. After Leyte Gulf, Japan had no ability to contest American naval superiority. The last hope of a decisive battle that would change American minds died in the waters off the Philippines. Still, they fought on. Iwo Jima, February to March 1945, a tiny volcanic island with 3 airfields. 21,000 Japanese defenders. They killed 7,000 Americans and wounded 19,000 more. Every one of the 21,000 Japanese defenders died fighting, and America took the island anyway. The fanatical resistance didn't break American will, it hardened it. Okinawa, April to June 1945, even worse. 12,000 Americans killed, 100,000 Japanese military dead, perhaps 150,000 Okinawan civilians killed in the fighting. The bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, and Japan lost. The strategy of making invasions so costly that America would negotiate instead of invade, it backfired completely. The casualties at Iwo Jima and Okinawa convinced American leadership that invading the Japanese home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, and that calculation helped lead to the decision to use atomic bombs. Meanwhile, American B-29s were firebombing Japanese cities. March 9, 1945, Tokyo. One night of incendiary bombing killed approximately 100,000 civilians and left 1 million homeless, more deadly than either atomic bomb. Over 60 Japanese cities were systematically burned. The conventional bombing campaign was destroying Japan's urban areas and industrial capacity. Still no surrender. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. An atomic bomb vaporizes the city center, kills 70,000 immediately, another 70,000 from radiation in the following months. The Soviet Union declares war on Japan and invades Manchuria. August 9th, Nagasaki. Another atomic bomb, another 40,000 dead immediately. And finally, after 2 atomic bombs, after the Soviets entering the war, after 3 years of knowing they couldn't win, Emperor Hirohito intervened personally and ordered surrender. August 15, 1945. Even then, a group of military officers attempted a coup to prevent the surrender broadcast. They failed. The emperor's speech was played on radio. Japan surrendered. And the language he used? The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The ultimate understatement. Millions dead, the country in ruins, 2 atomic bombs dropped, and the official position was that things hadn't gone quite as well as hoped. Here's what this all means. Japan's leadership knew at 3 different times that they couldn't win. Naval Command knew after Midway in June 1942. Economic and industrial planners knew by late 1942 and early 1943 when the production numbers became undeniable. The government knew after Saipan fell in July 1944. And yet, the war continued for another year, then another, because the political and cultural mechanisms to stop fighting didn't exist. From the moment Yamamoto knew they'd lost at Midway to the moment of surrender was 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. In that time, knowing victory was impossible. Over 2 million Japanese military personnel died. 500,000 Japanese civilians died. Millions of Chinese, Korean, Filipino, and other Asian people died. 2 atomic bombs were dropped. Dozens of cities were burned to ash. All of it preventable if knowledge of defeat had been enough to stop the fighting. But it wasn't. Because wars don't end when you know you've lost. They end when you can admit you've lost. And admitting defeat requires political will, cultural acceptance, and leadership willing to choose survival over honor. Japan had none of these until the emperor himself, the only person whose authority exceeded even the military's, said enough. This is the tragedy of the Pacific War's final years. Not that Japan lost. That was inevitable after Midway. The tragedy is that everyone knew they'd lost and they kept fighting anyway.